protests and was the scene last week of two separate attacks by security forces. Riot police have clashed with anti-government protesters in Algeria's capital. Officers broke up a rally after thousands gathered in the centre of the city. Police disrupted a similar rally last week, which was organised to call for better living conditions and greater freedom. And police in Kuwait have fired tear gas at protesters described as stateless long-term residents. They're demanding citizenship, free education, health care, benefits that are all available to Kuwaiti nationals. Protesters sang the Kuwaiti anthem and chanted slogans such as "We are Kuwaitis." And supporters and opponents of legislation to reduce the power of unions have held rival protests in the U.S. state of Wisconsin. The state's Republican governor says the legislation will help curb spending. Opponents say it will be the bargaining power for workers. Egypt Burning is next.
Began as a demonstration and turned into a revolution. 2 weeks of anti-government protests and Egypt is on a knife edge. Hosni Mubarak declares he won't run again for president. His son, Gamal, has been ruled out as the next in line. And a vice president, Omar Suleiman, has been appointed for the first time in 30 years. Egypt's health ministry says 11 people have been killed. But agencies report more than 300 deaths, with thousands more wounded. When protests began on the 25th of January, peaceful demonstrations were met with a brutal police force. As the calls for regime change move into their third week, Egyptians have broken down the barrier of fear. But cracks between the protesters have started to show.
What was really interesting about the third week of these protests is that everyone was talking about the momentum and momentum being lost, but the momentum that was being lost wasn't actually inside Liberation Square, where people were very much still united together in this quest to bring down Hosni Mubarak. The momentum that was changing was outside of the square, in the other parts of Cairo and beyond, where people had started to say, well, listen, Hosni Mubarak has now said that he won't run again. You only have to bear him for another few months. Why don't the protesters just leave the square? They've got what they want. So people were talking about a loss of momentum, but we never felt that inside Liberation Square. We only felt it outside.
I announced that I will similarly remain adamant to continue to shoulder my responsibility.
An immovable head of state and resolute protesters standing firm on their call for the president to resign. Egypt has reached deadlock. Tahrir Square has become a tent city, a permanent vigil for the anti-government protesters.
Every single night they're sleeping under the wheels of tanks and armoured personnel carriers, determined not to be squeezed in, as they put it, with this protest.
The mood by that morning had begun to shift a little bit, in the sense that shops were opening, stores were opening, very basic stuff, but enough to get enough commercial activity going where people themselves were beginning to question whether or not this prolonged standoff was serving the interests of the country, or whether or not it was being somewhat detrimental to the economic activity of daily life.
A fading momentum and Mubarak's promises of reform have threatened to derail the anti-government movement.
Well, by the time we had entered the third week, we could clearly see that there was no progress being made in terms of the talks. I mean, President Mubarak was adamant on trying to engage the protesters through political means. He was trying to appease them with what was described as half-hearted measures. And the protesters were very much defiant. You know, on more than one occasion, we felt that they were, you know, maybe their support was going to wane, perhaps their morale was going to decrease. But in reality, it never did.
Calls for regime change are in danger of dying out. But anti-government protesters receive a spark of hope from an unknown Egyptian. Google executive and political activist Wael Ghonem is released after his arrest by plainclothes policemen at the start of the protests. As an architect of the dissent that ignited a revolution, his emotional interview injects a sense of purpose into the softening protests.
I want to say to every mother and every father that lost his child, I'm sorry, but this is not our fault. I swear to God, this is not our fault. It is the fault of everyone who is holding on to power greedily and would not let it go. I want to leave.
Wael Ghonem's interview was definitely a game changer in the sense that it gave the protesters a huge public morale boost, and certainly one of great importance at a very critical time.
He spoke in this way that really, you know, pulled on the heartstrings of the protesters and in the Egyptian population in general, which by that point was starting to lose a little bit of that momentum and that really strong feelings that they were having towards the revolution. It humanized the revolution in a way that maybe it hadn't been humanized in the weeks beforehand.
As long as you are standing here, you are a hero. You are the heroes.
مصر فوق الجميع. 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 الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام.
As day breaks, the hundreds of Egyptians killed over the last 3 weeks are mourned. Thousands flock to Tahrir Square in the largest protest march against Mubarak yet, proof that they are still a force to be reckoned with. But the government message remains defiant, and Vice President Omar Suleiman delivers an ominous warning. There will be no ending of the regime and no immediate departure for President Hosni Mubarak.
This issue, we come around again to the issue of trust. And I have to say that you won't find many people or anyone who will trust assurances from this regime, whether it comes from Suleiman or anyone within the regime. Of course, everyone knows that the resounding message coming out of that massive demonstration